A black woman is placed in a difficult situation where she is treated disrespectfully and detained by police who also won't allow her make a telephone call. Miss Eleanor Grant, a longtime activist and well-liked elder in her community, was traveling to Jackson, Mississippi for a community organizing meeting. Her words had always been an inspiration to those around her, a voice of resiliency and hope for change. However, that afternoon, the officer saw a threat rather than an elder or a community leader. The dusty road went on forever, and the heat was pressing down on everything like a heavy blanket. The only visible indication of the rage that simmered beneath Eleanor's calm exterior was her knotted hands resting in her lap and their slight trembling as she sat in the back seat of her own car, which the local sheriff's deputies had commandeered. The patrol car bounced slightly on the uneven road, and the cuffs on her wrists bit into her skin. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" One of the officers looked at her in the rearview mirror with a sneer. "I believe that justice should be served by the law." Despite her racing heart and the fact that this officer is far from justice, Eleanor answered calmly in a steady, deep voice. The burly deputy next to her said, "Justice laugh? We say that justice is served when individuals simply don't know when to leave your place." Eleanor turned her gaze to the passing trees outside the window, the Mississippi landscape blurring into a mix of greens and browns. She knew there was no reasoning with them. Not here, not now. The fight was elsewhere, in the courtrooms, in the churches, in the streets, where voices joined together for a collective cry of freedom. When they arrived at the small, decrepit station on the outskirts of the town, Eleanor was dragged out of the car, her heels scraping against the gravel inside. The air smelled of mildew and old cigarettes smoke. A desk sergeant looked up briefly, then returned to his paperwork. Uninterested, Eleanor was led to a holding cell and shoved inside, the clang of the metal door echoing through the empty hallway. As she adjusted to the dim light, she sat on the cold bench and took a deep breath. She had been here before, not in this particular cell, but in the wider sense of being confined, silenced, and underestimated. She thought of the faces of the women she'd marched alongside, the prayers they'd whispered before crossing bridges or stepping into meeting halls filled with men who doubted their worth. She thought of the children she mentored, their wide eyes looking to her for guidance. Her dignity would remain intact. No cell could strip her of that. As the deputies went by, some laughing, some ignoring her completely, Eleanor remained silent for hours. Eventually, one of the officers smirked and said, "I bet you're regretting that big mouth of yours." She looked at him steadily, her expression unreadable, and she said, "The only regret I have is how long it's taking this country to wake up." The officer scowled as his confidence wavered in her presence. He muttered something under his breath and turned to go. As the night in the cell block grew quieter, Eleanor's thoughts drifted to the last time she'd spoken to her granddaughter Ava. The young woman had hugged her tightly before she left for Jackson, her arms warm and comforting. "You're the bravest person I know, Nana." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile because she wasn't a woman easily shaken, and she knew her strength unnerved men like him. Eleanor said, "This isn't about me," adding that it's about us and the strength we have when we stand together. "They may attempt to silence one voice, but they can't silence us. Every time they try to close a door, we will force it open," and the crowd erupts in applause. A chorus was played as the meeting went on, and plans for marches, legal challenges, and outreach to nearby communities were made. Eleanor watched as the younger leaders took charge, their enthusiasm lighting up the room. She knew her role was to mentor, guide, and remind them of the strength that comes from unity. Later that evening, as she sat in her modest home, Eleanor thought back on the day and the officers at the station. She considered AA, their will to continue the struggle, and the movement that had united them all as a force too powerful to be stopped. Their fear masquerading as authority. Eleanor Grant was aware that the path ahead would be lengthy and difficult, but she was also certain that they would not give up until justice was not only a dream but a reality for everybody.
Eleanor closed her eyes and clutched to the notion that she needed that strength after hearing Ava's admiring words. Her thoughts were immediately broken by the sound of footfall. The stocky officer stated, "Time for another little chat," as he opened the cell door and returned with a set of keys jangling. As she walked down the narrow hallway with two deputies escorting her, Eleanor stood, her movements slow but deliberate so they wouldn't see her fear. She saw the tall officer from earlier waiting in an interrogation room. His expression was cold and calculated. He said, "Sit down, ma'am," in a voice brimming with fake politeness. Eleanor remained silent and sank into the chair across from him. Her hands were folded neatly on the table and her back was straight. "You're in serious trouble. I don't believe you. A woman like you in a car like that doesn't add up to a woman like me," Eleanor said evenly, nothing more, nothing less. Miss Grant, the tall officer, started sliding a file across the table and driving through this part of town, stirring up trouble. "What were you really doing out there?" "I was traveling to Jackson to meet with community leaders." The officer's smirk faltered as he leaned forward in an attempt to regain control. Let me put it this way. You acknowledge that the car isn't yours and we let you leave, but we'll make sure you stay locked up for a long time. Eleanor's voice was calm, but the sharpness in her tone was unmistakable. You mean a black woman who owns a car and dares to use it? Eleanor didn't wince. Instead, she silently defied him by looking into his eyes. I refuse to confess to lying. I have the documents to show the officers that the automobile is mine. Jay tensed up and slammed a hand on the table. You're playing a dangerous game, ma'am, and so are you, Eleanor said. But the difference is I'm playing for justice. You're playing for power, and history has shown which one wins in the end. The officer glared at her until he suddenly stood up and signaled for the deputies to take her back to the cell. As they led her away, she heard him murmur to one of the younger officers, "Let her sit in there for a while longer. Perhaps that would make her more humble." Back in the cell, Eleanor didn't allow their remarks to press her. Instead, she sat on the bench and concentrated on her breathing while closing her eyes. She had overcome more difficult situations and emerged stronger. This was simply another phase of her continuous battle. She heard the hours stretch into what seemed like days. Deputies complaining about reporters calling the station in brief exchanges. Eleanor didn't let herself hope too much despite whispers from superiors that she should be released. But she knew her friends and allies wouldn't sit around doing nothing when the turning point arrived in the early morning when a disturbance at the front desk broke the station's stillness. Eleanor sat up, straining to hear, and a few moments later, the sound of assured footsteps filled the hallway. A loud, authoritative voice yelled out, "Miss Eleanor." Grant. Eleanor watched as two federal officials approached a woman wearing a smart gray suit to her cell. "My name is Lawyer Louise Carter." The woman said, "We're here to get you out," in a friendly yet stern tone. Eleanor felt a rush of comfort wash over her as her shoulders began to relax. When she stepped out of the cell, Louise gave her a phone and she felt the cool air of freedom for the first time in hours. "Your granddaughter has been anxious and ill and is eager to speak with you." Eleanor accepted the phone with a gesture of appreciation. But before she did so, she turned to face the stocky cop who was standing there, observing his pale and unsure face. "You see," she whispered softly, "the drive back to Jackson was a haze, but justice always finds a way." Eleanor assured Ava that she was protected throughout their brief conversation. When they arrived at the community center where the meeting was being held, a crowd had gathered outside cheering, and Eleanor stepped out of the car into a room that was brimming with energy. Louise gave her an update on the situation, explaining that the news of her arrest had caused outrage in the community and beyond. Every seat was occupied by concerned people, youth activists, and community leaders. Eleanor assumed the front seat, her presence dominating the space without need. The applause subsided as she started to speak, saying, "What happened to me is not unique." Her voice was strong despite the fatigue of the previous day. "It happens to our brothers and sisters every day in both big and small ways, but they are unaware that every act of injustice only makes us more determined.